Welcome to the Word Weaver podcast, a literary place in cyberspace where I share tangible tips, tricks, and words of wisdom to help you achieve your dream of writing a book. I'm your host, Louise Johnson, a writer and the author of Behind the Red Door. Let's dive into today's chapter. Hello, and welcome back to the Word Weaver podcast. Today's episode is about an age-old debate of can you separate the art from the artist? And for me, what I'm interested in today and what has made me want to talk about this topic. So I'm sitting here with my morning cup of coffee, as well as the Sunday Toronto Star. You can probably hear the crinkling of newspaper. And yes, I'm old-fashioned. I prefer reading the newspaper in a hard copy versus online when possible. And so I have it right in front of me, and there are two articles, front page of the Toronto Star. The first is an essay by Andrea Robin Skinner, who is Alice Munro's daughter, and it's titled, "My Mother Was Famous for Her Stories, This Is Mine." I highly encourage you to read this first-person account. I'm going to talk about it a bit today, but again, nothing can compare to her story in her own words. I will definitely not be able to summarize it in justice. And then the other article is right beside it. It's called "The Conspiracy of Silence" by Deborah Dundas and Betsy Powell, and it is a reported piece that accompanies the first-person essay. So if you're able to, I think online it's actually behind a paywall, but you might be able to find an archived version, or if anyone in your house, your grandparents, your parents, still gets a subscription to the Toronto Star newspaper, if you're Canadian, maybe they have it tossing around their recycling bin. Anyway, ever since I read both of these articles, it's what everyone kind of in the Canadian literary landscape, all of the authors and writers that I know are talking about in person, in their group chats, also online, on Instagram. So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I'm sure you are. If you are a reader or a writer in this sphere, you have definitely heard about this story. Alice Munro is a celebrated Canadian literary icon. She won the Nobel Prize as well as the Booker Prize. She recently died in May and was celebrated and lauded kind of as a Canadian national treasure. And her work centers a lot around the lives of women and girls, their interior, how they're feeling, how they react. And what came out recently, her daughter, Andrea Robin Skinner, in this extremely well-written, brave, honest, gut-wrenching account in this first-person essay, is that Andrea was sexually assaulted in 1976 for the first time by her stepfather, her mother, Alice Munro's husband, Gerald Fremlin, who I will refer to only as Gremlin from now on because he is the scum of the earth. He is revolting. And she was 9 years old when he first came into her bedroom, sexually assaulted her, and it went on until she was a teenager. She later came out and told her mother exactly what had happened, and Alice Munro, upon discovering and learning this from her daughter, believed her and then ultimately chose to stay with this predator, gaslighting her daughter, basically saying, "This is your issue, not mine." And eventually even the gremlin, Gerald Fremlin, was convicted and pleaded guilty to this sexual assault. And again, I encourage you, if you're able, to read this essay in its entirety in her own voice, because it goes on to detail how she was essentially excommunicated and ostracized from her own family, her mental health and eating disorder struggles. And just by the end, after reading it, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It left me heartsick, heartbroken, so profoundly sad for her. The one person, above all else, that is supposed to be there to protect you, found out about this and chose to do nothing. I can't even imagine in what world I would tell my own mother this news and she would choose to stay with the perpetrator who has done something to me. Or even now as a mother myself, if this news was brought to my attention, under no circumstances could I ever justify staying with someone who did that to my child. And how this was swept under the rug because of who she was, who Alice Munro was as this icon, this celebrated, cherished author. her daughter's story and her daughter's experience was completely erased, swept under the rug, to the point where she almost even gaslighted herself. Her siblings gaslighted her. Her own father ignored this situation, and just what that does to a person. I thought it was very well articulated and extremely brave of Andrea Skinner to come out with this piece. I also found it very interesting that her and her siblings noted that they still wanted their mother's work to be acknowledged for what it was, that they still felt she deserved the Nobel Prize. They weren't taking that art away from her, but as a mother, as her protector, she failed greatly. And of course, this has now ignited a firestorm of how do we absorb Alice Munro's work, past and moving forward. Even Chapters Indigo, they are removing Alice Munro, all of the advertisements in their stores. And I read recently, it was a Substack newsletter by Brandon Taylor. He's another author. So his Substack newsletter is called Sweater Weather. And I found out about it actually through another author. Her name's Stephanie Danler, who posted it online. So this piece in Brandon Taylor's newsletter, if you're looking it up, I will make sure to leave the link in the show notes, is called What I'm Doing About Alice Munro. And I thought it was an incredibly well-written account of everything that we're all grappling with. And what I really liked that he said, particularly in this newsletter, was that while he was reading the Toronto Star first person essay by Andrea Skinner about what happened to her, he said, "Not for one moment was I thinking about Alice Munro and her work. I was only thinking about her daughter and what had happened to her." And that is absolutely true. I was not thinking about Alice Munro and her work. All I was thinking about was, how could a mother do this to her daughter? So I thought Brandon Taylor really profoundly described the feeling of his own sexual abuse as a child. And he could relate to Andrea Robin Skinner in that he said, it would have been almost easier if I had told my parents or I had told the adults in charge and they hadn't believed me, because then I would have had a place to channel my anger. But it was worse telling my parents, just like it was for Andrea Robin Skinner, to tell Alice Munro what had happened to her and to be believed, but for them to do nothing, and not only do nothing about it, but to stay with the perpetrator and allow them to continue to exist as though nothing happened at all. That experience was worse than telling them and not being believed. And I couldn't stop thinking about that. And it is so, so true, because it not only allows room for you to gaslight yourself and your own experience, because it seems as though nothing has happened. That person is allowed to stay, even though you're believed. They believe that what happened to you, the assault, actually did happen. And it also leaves the door open for everyone else who is involved. So for Andrea Robin Skinner, her siblings, her biological father, they also swept it under the rug. And by proxy, they were also complicit in gaslighting this entire experience and continuing to allow this predator to affect their sister and their daughter. And it just really sickened me. And it's something that will stick with me. Not only the cases where people are not believed, but also where they are and the people in power around them choose to do nothing. And then again, just now, 5 days after the stunning revelation about Alice Munro, there was a Rolling Stone article that came out about author Neil Gaiman having sexually assaulted two young women when they were in their early 20s and he was in his mid to late 40s. So within the span of a week, we have these bombshell revelations about Alice Munro and Neil Gaiman, which has just reignited the age-old debate about, can you separate the artist from their body of work? It also brings to mind, of course, for me, JK Rowling, just this whole idea of problematic authors and how we absorb and let their work into our lives. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I want to talk about it. There's also a book that I read, I believe it was last year, called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Dederer. And that's a great read that really delves deep into this topic of, can you separate the art from the artist, and should we separate the art from the artist? She goes into not just authors, but also creatives like Woody Allen, Michael Jackson, everyone that we kind of put on a pedestal and we find out that they do bad things. How do we approach the art in the aftermath of that. I think a part for me of what was so shocking in learning about Alice Munro is also that we're used to hearing about this from the patriarchy. For some reason, when I heard about Neil Gaiman and read the Rolling Stone article, it didn't hit me as much of a gut punch as it did reading about Alice Munro. And I had to pause and ask myself, why? Why does this seem less shocking or less surprising? And for me, it's kind of the Harvey Weinstein effect of we're used to, or it is more common for men in the patriarchy to take advantage of women. So, what the gremlin, Gerald Fremlin, did to Andrea Robin Skinner is almost less shocking because we have heard this story before than learning about Alice Munro, which is also gross in itself and is something to be further dissected because a lot of people play different roles in silencing victims and allowing abusers to get away with abuse. And I wonder if that's why male artists in particular, and I don't know if this is true or not. This is just me talking out loud, but I wonder if they almost get away and their art is celebrated longer. And I wonder if this will affect Neil Gaiman's work, for instance, as much as it will Alice Munro's work, because we're used to men in power doing terrible things, like the Harvey Weinstein, Woody Allens of the world. But when it's a beloved figure, a wife, a mother, a cherished, celebrated, Nobel Prize winning author like Alice Munro, it is somehow more jarring because we don't expect someone like her to be capable of doing bad things. So I do grapple with this topic, and lately I've been asking myself, do I personally separate the art from the artist? How will I move forward with knowing this information? And I actually broke out my journal when I was doing morning pages and kind of started writing about this because it's so top of mind for me. And I kind of approached it initially on a case by case basis. Let's take JK Rowling, Harry Potter, for example. I grew up as a huge, huge Harry Potter fan. I would wait every summer for the new book to be released, and as soon as I got it, I would crack open the spine and I wouldn't sleep until I had finished the book. And those were hefty, hefty volumes, very big reads for me at that age. But those are really ingrained childhood memories. Harry Potter is one of the big reasons why I wanted to be a writer and a big part of my childhood reading life, how I fell in love even deeper with reading, wanting to write stories like that myself, and just being transported to another wizarding world is something that is such a part of my DNA now and who I am as a writer and as an author that learning about JK Rowling, I absolutely disagree with her opinion, her stance, everything about what she puts out there about trans rights. I just think it's disgusting. I am shocked that someone who wrote Harry Potter thinks this way. So for me, JK Rowling as a person, as a writer, as an author, as an artist, she is tainted for me. But then I go, but I love Harry Potter so much. I watch the movies every Christmas. I have all of the books still on my shelf. But sometimes when I look at the books on the shelf, I go, should I be donating these? Should I not be showcasing Harry Potter when the person who created them, I fundamentally disagree with their views? So again, can I separate the art from the artist? So I go back to this book by Roland Barthes. It was released in 1967 or 1968, and it's called The Death of the Author. And essentially, what it says is that once the text or a book is released, it is no longer the author's, it belongs to the reader. How the reader interprets the work, how they absorb it based on their own past experiences, their personal biases, and essentially the author releases it. So in that sense, the art is separated from the artist because it then belongs to the reader. So that concept of once the book is released, it is no longer belonging to the artist. The art belongs to the person who is reading it. I think about that with Harry Potter and JK Rowling specifically because the Harry Potter series was so formative to my childhood, my love of reading. The art had embedded itself in me as a core part of my reading DNA before I found out about the terrible thing that the artist did. So, in a sense, I think of the art as being preserved in this before period, before I found out that the artist was a monster, as Claire Dederer would call her. Also, in all the years that I was reading Harry Potter, I never once was thinking about JK Rowling while I was engaging with the art, with the book. I was just fully immersed in the story and the world. I was not once thinking about the artist. So I was separating it already then, even though I didn't know her viewpoint or opinion at that time. But now that I know better, I can do better. I can't unknow this information. And it's kind of like what Oprah always says, when you know better, you do better. So now that I know better, I will do better. I won't be rushing out to buy any of her future works. I know that JK Rowling releases books under a pen name, Robert Galbraith. So I won't be rushing out to buying those books anytime soon. I won't be supporting the artist moving forward. I have no interest in that. But I think there is a place to still be able to enjoy the Harry Potter series for what they were, in the sense that the art became mine and embedded itself in me before I learned of this terrible thing, if that makes sense. That being said, if I were to reread Harry Potter now, I don't know if I would engage with it in the same way, because I would always kind of be thinking in the back of my head, the artist would be a little bit at the forefront. JK Rowling and what I know about her, her voice would be kind of hovering there like a ghost within the pages. And before, I never once thought about her while I was reading it. I wasn't really interested in the artist. I was fully immersed in the art. So just something to think about, and that this is me just working through it. And then now fast forward to Alice Munro and Neil Gaiman. I have the same feelings of moving forward, the artist is tainted for me. I will never be able to engage with their work in the same way, knowing what they have done, because they will always now be at the forefront of the art, of the work. Especially Alice Munro writes about women and girls and their interior lives. And I will always be thinking of how she treated her own daughter. Again, the voice of the author will come through the words, and I just personally won't be able to engage in the same way, unfortunately. That being said, there was a period before where I knew this information and I really enjoyed Alice Munro's works. So I enjoyed the art for what it was. I wasn't thinking about the author, but once they do a terrible thing that comes to light, I really don't believe, and this is for me personally, that you can separate the art from the artist fully. So the haphazard conclusion that I kind of came to while roughly journaling about this is that I did separate the art from the artist before I learned about the terrible things that they did. So before all of this knowledge came to light about JK Rowling, Alice Munro, Neil Gaiman, when I engaged with their art, their books, I was not thinking about them as an artist. They were kind of this anonymous figure in the background. Their personal lives wasn't, for me, part of the work that I was absorbed in and enjoying. So there's a marked period of before and after learning about their abhorrent behavior for me now as an artist, where I can no longer separate the art from the artist, because the artist is so much more at the forefront of what they did. So anytime I engage with their books, their articles, their art moving forward, I can't help but think of the artist. Whereas in the period before, I wasn't thinking of them at all. I hope that makes sense when I'm talking it through. This is the first time I'm having the opportunity to talk about it out loud, work through my opinion. I know a lot of us authors, creatives are grappling with this. I would love to know your opinion, your stance. This is an open forum, open dialogue. I feel like we're building a really great literary community here. And these are the kinds of topics I feel we shouldn't be afraid to talk about, especially as authors, readers, writers, people who are actively engaged with books and creative art. So those are my thoughts on this big topic of can you separate the artist from their body of work, from the art? And like I said, moving forward, I don't think you can separate the art from the artist. I think the work will always be tainted in the aftermath of learning about the great, big, terrible, no good, despicable behavior that they exhibited. It does, for me personally, affect the art. But like I said, in the period before learning about this, I never once separated the art from the artist because I was so fully engaged with the work itself. And really, I was just embodying what Roland Barthes was talking about in The Death of the Author, that once the work was released in this before period, it no longer belonged to the artist. It felt like it belonged to me, the reader. And there are certain works that definitely affected me like that. Alice Munro's work was one of those, Harry Potter's work was one of those. But moving forward, I will not be rushing to support them as artists. So even though before I really enjoyed and loved the work, now that I know better, I want to do better. And for me, I cannot in good conscience consume the art in the same vein moving forward. There are too many amazing artists, authors out there. I have a sky high and ever growing TBR pile. So Neil Gaiman does not need a place on that list. There are too many other amazing authors out there and work that I would much prefer to consume. I also just want to caveat by saying that I know authors and writers are flawed humans. They are not these perfect people, although we often put them on a pedestal. But I absolutely do think in these instances, they absolutely need to be called out for it and held accountable. All right, that is it for this week's episode. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe, leave a comment, a review. It really helps other people find out about the Word Weaver podcast. Also, if you're more of a visual person, you can watch full episodes on YouTube. And of course, listen wherever you get your podcasts, from Apple iTunes to Spotify. I'll chat with you again soon. Thanks for listening.